Thank you. Well, what I want to share really is a few reflections about the way in which the Nicaea anniversary might have offered us something to learn for the ecumenical movement, because I think it's been kind of a proxy for some other things as well as itself in a way. So I want to start just by echoing what Peter said about the number of events and how surprising that has been. When we started thinking about this year in the World Council of Churches at Faith and Order, I was struck first of all by the fact that on one side of the room there were those who would want to say that Constantine was the 13th apostle and all those who went to Nicaea were saints. And on the other side of the room, there were people who said this is the moment Christianity sold out to empire. And I thought, how is this ever going to be a point of unity? Um, and I also struggle to imagine how many of the people I know in the churches I know best would respond. But there have been so many events, and I'm sure Peter's right that we could, fill the time just by naming them. Um, I heard Rowan Williams say recently that it was the seventh talk he'd given on Nicaea this year, and I thought, well, now I've done more than that. Who knew? Um, So I think everyone who's been part of planning this year has been overwhelmed. And I think that has taught us something in itself. So I know there have been many academic conferences, and I went to a really wonderful one in Thessaloniki with the Academy, American Academy of Religion, really, where I heard all sorts of intriguing talks about things like the struggle they had to translate the Nicene Creed after Nicaea into Syriac. I've been to many church events, CTE, local churches, tiny chapels, cathedrals, all sorts of things. Only last week I was speaking at Wells Cathedral. There have been new hymns and worship songs and prayers newly written, the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, as we've already heard. Um, Various churches have developed courses for lay people, for all sorts of people on Nicaea. The Diocese of Europe, I know, I can see from their website, has done a great deal. And in the World Council, we've developed a six session course. And the last I heard was that something like 500 people had said they wanted to do it, which is absolutely astonishing for something like that. There have been, the WCC webinar on the filioque clause has been one of the most popular. Amazing. There have been radio programs, TV programs. I know there was a Songs of Praise with Archbishop Angelos and with Bishop Rowan. Sarah Parvis commented in the Tablet last week, Nicaea experts are having their day in the sun. And not just the experts, but all of us who might be asked to speak. And only this last weekend, of course, you will have seen the visit of Pope Leo and His Holiness the Ecumenical Patriarch to the site of Nicaea, accompanied by, though it's not often reported, by the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches and other Protestant church leaders too. They made statements there, they prayed there, and there was an apostolic letter from Pope Leo issued just beforehand. I know it's not celebrity traitors, but it's been amazing how much interest there has been. And I think that in itself teaches us something. There's been interest from those you might expect and from those that you wouldn't. I've done talks amongst those who were very keen already on responding to Nicaea, and also talks with, like one I gave in the Netherlands, with churches who, on the whole, be pretty skeptical. And they'd only asked me because I'd written an article saying convincing skeptical Protestants like me to celebrate the anniversary of Nicaea. So huge interest. I think that it shows, for example, that people are interested in doctrine. And so often in the ecumenical movement, I hear people say, doctrine divides, service unites. It's best to keep off doctrinal issues because we'll disagree. But this has reminded us that there are doctrinal issues around which we can gather. Maybe not all of us, maybe not all of us in the same way, but there is something that we can agree on together. And I think certainly from our place in Britain, in the UK at the moment, um, there's a need, I think there's a felt need for us to be clear about what Christianity actually is, what it is that we believe, because we see, for example, Christianity being co-opted by far-right movements. And so there is this sense of, well, what is it that we believe? And how can we say that together in a way that will catch the public imagination, and stand up for what is the truth? In a sense, um, I think I gained a new sense of what Athanasius must have felt, and those who were very keen to make sure that at Nicaea that we found the right way to speak about who Jesus is. I think we've learned that doctrine is important, not just for the sake of unity, but for the sake of clarity. We've learned, I think, about the power of a short, concise text, which the Nicene Creed in both its versions is, the size of a Facebook post, as someone put it to me. The Church of Wales calls the Nicene Creed a sufficient statement of the Christian faith. I've written, edited, studied many ecumenical texts. This one is much shorter than any of them, and I think all the better for that. I think we've discovered again the importance of wrestling with the faith as it actually is, rather than with the stereotypes of one another that we often peddle. And it's been helpful, I think, to take many of us back to the two versions of the Nicene Creed, the original version in 325 and what it became in 381, to tell the story and to engage with the actual Greek in which it was written. And I've always found people are fascinated by that. So one of the things I learned in engaging with the Greek, for example, was that Pantocrator might not mean almighty. It can mean the one who holds all things, or who created all things, the one who holds all things in his hands. So, there are different ways of interpreting the Greek. The Greek that refers to us as human beings means human beings, not men, not for us men, as I learned when I was growing up in a bad English translation. And we've discovered, I think, and we've reflected on what potential texts have, that they're not necessarily only what their original intention, their original authors intended, but they have potential to be subversive in ways that perhaps originally wasn't meant. So we've learnt something about texts and how to interpret them, and the fascination that people have with that. The Nicaea anniversary has made us think about what we really believe about God and what we believe about God together. So we've learned, for example, to say, who is the one who is of the same being as God? It's Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet who told parables, who spoke of a kingdom of God that was so different from the kingdom of this world, the one who healed the sick, who washed the feet of his disciples, who was a victim of empire, not a supporter of it. Perhaps it teaches us that homoousios, to see the first person of the Trinity through the lens of the second, rather than the other way round. So it's made us go back and think about what we believe together about God. I think that's a healthy situation for us in the ecumenical movement. I heard one of Rowan Williams's 7 lectures, or yeah, I think at least one. But I remember him saying that what Nicaea reveals to us is a God whose nature is always to be creating, begetting, being in relationship. not an abstract philosophical God, as people sometimes accuse Nicaea of being. This is a God who is from the beginning, always begetting. And Pope Leo recently in his apostolic letter said something similar. The Nicene Creed does not depict a distant, inaccessible and immovable God who rests in himself, but a God who is close to us and accompanies us on our journey in the world, even in the darkest places on earth. His immensity is revealed when he makes himself small, laying aside his infinite majesty to become our neighbour in the little ones and in the poor. This revolutionizes pagan and philosophical conceptions of God. So again, looking at the Nicene Creed can revive in us a sense of what it is we really believe about God. So it's been a precious opportunity to ask who Jesus is for each one of us, that he's not a charismatic man or a superhero, as Pope Leo urges us not to reduce him to that, but he is revealing the very nature of God. What is Christianity? That's what Nicaea asks us. And even if we don't agree with everything Nicaea says, it gives us this opportunity to ask the question. So that is, if you like, doctrine. Then unity. I think the Nicaea anniversary has provided a moment of recommitment to the journey towards full communion for many, maybe not for all, but for many, and an inspiration to commit ourselves, as those at Nicaea did, to the journey. And it's been fascinating to hear the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch, for example, talk about the kind of unity that is not a return, not rolling back history, and not simply a mutual recognition of diversity, but full communion. And this was evident both in what Pope Leo and the Ecumenical Patriarch said this weekend, but also at the World Conference that we had on Faith and Order in Wadi al Natrun only a month or so ago. I think what this anniversary has also given us is a sense of the importance of ecumenism, not only globally or in places, but an ecumenism through time. The kind of ecumenism that makes clear that we are in communion with a living tradition through the ages. And I think that's something that particularly many Protestant churches, certainly my own, have needed to learn. That ecumenism is not just about the Catholicity of the church across the globe now, but the Catholicity of the church through the ages. Pope Leo, reflecting on the ecumenical movement, said recently in his letter, it's achieved much in the last 60 years. It is true that full visible unity with the Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches and with the ecclesial communities born of the Reformation has not yet been reached. Nevertheless, ecumenical dialogue, founded on one baptism and the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, has led us to recognize the members of other churches and ecclesial communities as our brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, and to rediscover the one universal community of Christ's disciples throughout the world. We share the same faith. Now, I regret in a way that, well, I do regret that Pope Leo referred to ecclesial communities, referring to the Protestant churches. And Cardinal Koch used many of the same words at Wadi al Natrun, at the Faith and Order conference, and I don't remember him referring to ecclesial communities quite in that way. But clearly Pope Leo's intention is to recognise that though we've come a long way, we need to go further. And the Nicene Creed can be a basis and reference point, something to hold on to as we make that journey. Cardinal Koch and Pope Leo, clearly their texts were very similar, both said this about unity. That unity without multiplicity is tyranny. Multiplicity without unity is fragmentation. That's worth repeating, I think. Unity without multiplicity is tyranny. Multiplicity without unity is fragmentation. So there they're talking about how to balance diversity and unity. And Pope Leo says, this does not imply an ecumenism that attempts to return to the state prior to the divisions, nor is it a mutual recognition of the current status quo of the diversity of churches. Rather, it is an ecumenism that looks to the future, that seeks reconciliation through dialogue as we share our gifts and spiritual heritage. So the Nicaea anniversary has kind of provided an opportunity for some important statements about where we've got to in terms of unity and where we might yet go. And there are many people who still think that all the Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic Church are still seeking an ecumenism of return. But Pope Leo could not have been clearer that that's not the case, that we're talking about a common pilgrimage into a common future, not a return to the past. And the ecumenical patriarch said this at Nicaea: "We are here not simply to remember the past, but to bear living witness to the same faith in order to move forward." So, if nothing else, the Nicaea anniversary has provided an opportunity for such statements to be made before the world's press, which I think is wonderful. And a final point about unity, or perhaps two more points. One is that a spiritual ecumenism has become really important. Ecumenism that's not only about documents and agreements and doctrinal discussion, but also about growing in faith together, sharing spirituality. So sometimes people talk about an ecumenism of doctrine or an ecumenism of shared action, whereas there is often this space in between, which is shared spiritual resources. A spiritual challenge which requires repentance and conversion on the part of all. We need the spiritual ecumenism of prayer, praise, and adoration, as expressed by the Creed of Nicaea and Constantinople. One thing I've learned through this whole year is that there are many churches, many Christians for whom the Creed is not a doctrinal tick list, but is something to be prayed. And I have heard people speak about praying the Nicene Creed. So that it's not that you have to check you believe every word, but it's like singing a hymn, saying a prayer. And I was really struck at the Faith and Order Conference in Egypt that the worship at this Faith and Order Conference was absolutely part of the whole event, because in the worship we prayed, we sang, we reflected on the faith that is there in the Nicene Creed. We weren't only talking about it and analysing it, but praying it and singing it. I even felt at one stage moved to write a hymn myself. And finally, on unity, I think the Nicaea anniversary has brought some impetus to bilateral conversations, and we can see how important those have become as part of the journey to full communion. That multilateral conversations are often incredibly complex, and though important, they sometimes can't make the steps that you can take in a bilateral conversation. So there has been a wonderful Lutheran Orthodox dialogue this year, which has included a statement on the Filioque, where Lutherans and Orthodox agreed together that the Filioque is not necessarily heretical, but in ecumenical gatherings, it's better and more sensitive not to say it. So there was a kind of step forward in terms of that controversy that has been there since the 6th century. And I noticed how important it was in the Pope's visit recently that he did not say the filioque. So I've talked about doctrine, faith, I've talked about unity. I think there's also something about mission, particularly for us in Europe, that the Nicaea anniversary has stirred up. There's a sense, I think we all have a sense of our need to find ways of speaking the faith into the cultures where we are with resonance. And I think I imagine, I believe that those at Nicaea were doing something similar. They were only a few years out of a time of intense persecution. Christianity had become, they were no longer persecuted, but it was still a minority. And they were seeking at Nicaea to find a way of putting it into words, few words, that would mean something in the street language of the world in which they lived. And we're presented with the same kind of challenge. We need to provide a credible witness to the gospel in order to bring hope to our increasingly divided world. We need to find words today to communicate the faith in ways that will resonate in the cultures we inhabit. So I think there's something about faith and doctrine, unity and mission. I just want to say a little bit about critique, because I come from a tradition that has, the default position on the creeds would be to say, these can be used to enforce faith. They're not personal faith. They've become tools of colonialism and power. And that debate has still been part of the discourse, as it should be. One of the meetings which I most enjoyed about Nicaea was a meeting called by USPG, the United Society for Partnership in the Gospel, where they gathered about a dozen theologians from across the world, and we each had to come with 500 words. That's all, not a long paper with footnotes, just 500 words about Nicaea. And on the first day, we shared our 500 words, and we were in very different places about what we thought about Nicaea. Many there seeing it as a tool of empire, for example. On the second day, we went to Nicaea. We went on a pilgrimage together. We got to know each other. And on the third day, we came together and prepared a common statement. And we decided between us that we could say that the creed was in the empire, but not of the empire. And as we interpreted the text of the creed carefully together, we could see its subversive potential. That it says we believe in one God and one Lord, no other gods, no other lords. That Jesus is the one who is homoousios, who is of one being with God. That Jesus is said to have died under Pontius Pilate, says the creed. He was a victim of empire, not its advocate, and it's his kingdom that will have no end, at a time when the Roman Empire was tottering. Jesus came for us all and for our salvation, not only for the mighty, not even perhaps only for believers, but for us all. And the Holy Spirit is the source and giver of life, all life. So I hope that the Nicaea anniversary has offered us some things about clarity in terms of our faith, about unity in terms of seeking full communion with passion and commitment, and something about resonance in the culture in which we live.